Welcome, everyone, to the OnPoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, the PC Party has released its platform only days before Election Day. Not too late for us to get into the details.
In the closing days of the campaign, we'll look at where the leaders are and which seats they're fighting for.
And we've covered the English leaders debate, the Francophone debate, but what about the disability issues debate? We'll look into what was raised there.
It's Tuesday, February 25th, 2025, our last podcast before E-Day, so let's get to it.
Hey, JMM,
Sir.
our last one. Apologies for the bad throat off the top for starters. Still haven't recovered from the hockey game.
You showed too much.
Yeah. First of all, what are you wearing today?
This is one of my Star Wars spaceship T-shirts.
Oh, okay.
And
we got to push at the edges of your comfort zone a bit. Maybe get into some different ideas.
Maybe next time I'll find something with a slogan or something.
Okay. Well, I wore today something that I think is appropriate to the occasion, and humor me for a moment as I go through all this. Do you remember a guy named Chris Stockwell?
I do indeed.
Does that name ring a bell? Okay, I met Chris probably 40 years ago when he was a Toronto City Councillor, and I was covering City Hall. And he was a very outspoken, very quotable guy, represented Etobicoke. And I don't know, we got to know each other, and he decided eventually he was going to run provincially, ran in 1995 for Mike Harris. And even though he had a lot of experience in public life, and his dad had been in public life before him, Mike Harris made it a point not to put him in cabinet, and Chris was expecting to get into cabinet. And when Mike called him in for an interview, for a meeting, just to say to him, I'm not putting you in cabinet, he hit the roof. You know, it was like, F you, F this party, F this government, F this whole Anyway, he went kind of crazy. He eventually, because Mr. Harris lost some cabinet ministers along the way, got into cabinet. He also became the Speaker of the legislature and got a modicum of revenge against the Harris government when he found them in contempt of the legislature on one occasion.
Yes.
He may be, and let's do a little trivia here, he may be best remembered for a moment in 1999, you know, when they went to fewer politicians.
Yes.
So you had, in some cases, two Conservative MPPs running against each other for the nomination.
Yep.
So there were two Etobicoke MPPs who had to run against each other. You're smiling. You remember who he beat?
Yes, he beat Doug Ford Sr.
That is correct.
Yes.
He beat the Premier's father. So he put an end to Doug Ford Sr.'s political career. Anyways, as the shirt indicates, when Mike Harris stepped down, they had a leadership convention to replace him. Ernie Eves won that convention. Chris Stockwell actually came last. But he had a great campaign. He had a lot of fun. He enjoyed giving the speech. And then shortly thereafter, I remember calling Chris and saying, I'm hearing bad things about you, about your health. What's going on? And he said, I don't believe everything you hear. And not long after that, he died of cancer at the age of 60, which was crazy. Way too young. And that was 7 years ago this month. So I'm wearing this shirt to remember Chris Stockwell today on the 7th anniversary of his passing. But what a great guy and a fun guy. I remember having him sitting over there on the agenda one day, and he was having a debate with somebody, and he said, you know what? You're backing up so fast from your previous position, I can hear you beeping. He was that kind of guy. Lots of fun.
And has a terrific portrait at the legislature. If you ever get to go to the legislature, most of the speakers, or many of the speakers, get their portraits, and his is still hanging in the legislature, and it really is one of the better ones at the legislature.
Absolutely right. Okay, let's get on to sort of the news of the week, and which included another trip by Doug Ford to Washington. What came out of that?
Right. So, I mean, there have been criticisms, once again, of the premier traveling during a election campaign. Allegations that, this is kind of just a showboat maneuver by the provincial premier as well. There isn't exactly, how to put this, unambiguous leadership from the federal level. Ford, for his part, says that he believes that the premiers are moving the needle. They're, meeting with governors. This was a strategy that both federal and provincial politicians used during the first Trump administration, right? If you're not getting anywhere with the White House, talk to governors, talk to representatives, talk to senators, and work on the relationships there. Again, I think not clear that it's having a lot of effect, but in part that's because the Trump White House is so chaotic. They say one thing one day, another thing the next day.
You don't say.
And sometimes two completely different things within the same day. So very hard to judge whether that's actually having any progress. Perhaps the most notable thing has been that we did get an indication of the enforcement of the caretaker convention. We have talked about this at length in the podcast, the idea that the government stays the government during an election campaign, but isn't supposed to use all of their powers for their own partisan benefit. And so last week we learned that Michelle D'Emmanuel, who is the Secretary of Cabinet, this is the highest ranking Ontario civil servant, she read the riot act a little bit.
Wrapped his knuckles a bit.
Yes, specifically for the ad that the PC party cut after the first trip to Washington that ended with the partisan logo emblazoned at the end of the ad. That ad was taken down. They republished it without the partisan messaging. But D'Emmanuel more or less said, like, hey, like, this is not cool. Knock that off. And she did also criticize the government for designating campaign staffers as government officials for the trip. They were incorrectly classified. You know, I mentioned this not just because it was news and it was worth mentioning, but when we talk about a convention, I think people sometimes ask, like, okay, but whose job is it to enforce this rule, right? And the thing about conventions, what makes them distinct from laws and regulations is that it is not the court's jobs or the police or government regulators to enforce these rules. These conventions get enforced in a different way. And here, it's the Secretary of Cabinet who, is the one responsible for enforcing the caretaker convention. And here we see Michelle D'Emmanuel rising to that task. We know that she did this in part because Liberal, I guess he was the leader in the House in the previous legislature, but Liberal MPP John Fraser wrote a letter to her, and her response to Mr. Fraser then made it to newspapers.
It does get a little awkward because, of course, Michelle D'Emmanuel has her job because Doug Ford appointed her to that position. Yes. And she's now in a position of having to give him HE double hockey sticks for what he transgressed on. So awkward, yes? Yes,
you can imagine that's a bit awkward, and yet at the same time, I would say certainly Ms. D'Emmanuel has demonstrated her qualities by not letting the fact that Doug Ford appointed her to this position get in the way of enforcing the rules.
Right on. And with that, I'm going to enforce the rules and get us to issue 1. On the last Monday before Election Day, the Progressive Conservative Party released its platform outlining $40 billion in spending promises. JM is going to walk us through some of those highlights. $40 billion. You like that number, first of all?
Yeah, well, let's start with that number. So this is the figure provided by the PC party, but they did not release anything that I think you could fairly call a detailed costing of their platform. If you are the kind of voter for whom a detailed costing is really important to you, I think I could say without fear of bias, that the Green Party really is the front runner in terms of having released the most detailed costing. The Liberals and NDP released their platforms on Friday. They attached costings. I would say they were not as detailed as the Green Party. And the PC party has, frankly, barely published a costing at all. Some of the most expensive promises that they have made in their platform cannot possibly be included in that $40 billion figure. I mentioned, of course, the tunnel under the 401. That would almost as a physical law would need to cost more than $40 billion. Therefore, the fact that the PC party is saying $40 billion in spending, they must not be including all of that construction cost in this platform costing.
No, fair enough. But, well, let's put it this way. Is there anything new at all in this platform?
It was very much a collection of the promises that have been made this far in the campaign. I don't want to be overly uncharitable, but at one point I kind of imagined, some PC staffer just stapling all the old press releases together. There were, however, some new items. The government is proposing to eliminate the minimum price for liquor at the LCBO. The government used to have a minimum price for beer. You might recall that the Premier promised to bring back a buck of beer in his first government. They are now proposing to eliminate the minimum price for alcohol at the LCBO. This is a policy that the LCBO uses to moderate people's consumption, frankly, right? It's part of what they call their social responsibility policy. The Premier asked about this, said, like, this policy doesn't really exist in other provinces. Why are we still doing it here in Ontario? It's actually not clear to me that that's correct, that I think there are still some other provinces that moderate prices this way, but regardless, the Premier says it's time to get rid of that. Probably the most interesting elements of the platform, to me anyway, were two big things that were missing. First of all, nowhere in the document will you see the PC Party commit to building 1.5 million new homes by 2031.
And that has been a signature promise for years.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's substantial government policy that is built around cajoling, prodding, pleading with municipalities to get more homes built, get more building permits issued, that kind of thing, all wrapped around this idea of getting 1.5 million new homes built by 2031. That promise is not in the platform. Premier asked about it, first said, well, we're working with municipalities to streamline applications. And that's true. They are doing that work. And even before the election, they were announcing substantial amounts of money to encourage municipalities to improve infrastructure that homes need, things like plumbing and roads. But yeah, at least in the text of the platform, that promise is no longer there. Also missing, no pledge to balance the budget over the next 4 years. I note this because the fall economic statement and the budget from last year both talked about a path to balance. And the budget is cautious, right? The budget talks about, like, okay, well, if the economy is very good, then we could get to balance faster. And if it's not so good, then it might take us longer. But there was a path to balance. The Premier asked about this omission in the platform, said basically, we don't know. With Trump's tariffs, if the economic hit that poses to the Ontario economy, we not only would that be such a hit to our revenues, we would need to spend so much to support businesses and workers that, he compared it to COVID, right? He's saying more or less, if these tariffs do in fact arrive, we will necessarily go back into deficit, or rather, we are already in deficit. We will go into a more substantial deficit, and yeah, no promise to balance the budget between now and the next 4 years.
Do we have a clip of the Premier?
Yes, we do. He was asked about that.
Well, it depends on the deficit. If if the tariffs hit us, yes, we won't be able to balance, because it's just similar to the pandemic. We're going to invest into the people. I'm going to protect the families, protect businesses. That's what I'm going to do.
Okay, for what it's worth, there's a group in Ottawa called Democracy Watch. It's run by a guy named Duff Conacher. And that organization has apparently been looking at platforms for many, many years. And they put a press release out just this morning, actually, saying the Ford PC Party received an F fail grade overall, and in all 5 areas of Democracy Watch's report card, it is the worst grade ever for any party across Canada for the past 30 years.
Yeah.
So they don't seem to find the specificity that you or many others have been looking for in a party platform.
Yeah, just to give people a sense of the kinds of things that Democracy Watch is judging the parties on. They are a government oversight group. I think we could fairly call them that. So, they are looking at things like strengthening the offices of officers of the legislature, like the Auditor General or the Financial Accountability Officer, making them appointed by an independent board of the legislature and not appointed by MPPs as they currently are. I would say the Auditor General still has very, very substantial independence, so that may not be like the most important thing. But there's lots of things. You can go to their website, and I'm just going to very quickly, talk about. They would like to see more regulation of lobbyists, making sure that politicians and their staff can't become lobbyists immediately after leaving office. That kind of thing. Strengthening access to information rules. As journalists, I think we can fairly say big fan of that. and then more democratically minded reforms, things like changing election rules. And I'm scanning this as we go, but I can't remember whether they want a commitment to proportional representation, but I think Democracy Watch has asked for that in the past. We have seen in this election campaign, and again, I'm going to try not to editorialize too much, but the government has undeniably used a lot of its powers of incumbency to its own advantage. And even if you disregard the trips to Washington, we can just talk about choosing the election date in a context where there was no requirement for an early election outside of the political argument that Premier Ford has been making about needing a mandate, right? There was no constitutional or legal requirement for the election to be held when it was. And certainly the timing has been to the government's benefit. And those are the kinds of things that Democracy Watch is grading the parties on. And, no surprise that the PC party has a straight F student, never what you want to see as a parent. But it's not like this was a wash for the other parties. I mean, I'm just looking at their other report cards. The Greens get quite a few C's and C minuses. The Liberals, some D's and F's. The NDP also F's and C's. So
seems like they've all got a long way to go before they meet the higher standards that Democracy Watch would like to see.
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. There are 2 pretty reliable ways to figure out what the state of play is in an election campaign. Number 1, check the polls. Number 2, check where the leaders are spending their time. If they're going to places where they already had seats in the last House, it shows potentially a lack of confidence in picking up new seats. Conversely, if you're going to places that your opponent held in the last House, that suggests you think you've got a shot to pick up new seats. So let's see who's where. What do you want to tell us?
Right. So we have Doug Ford is making a campaign stop in Ottawa today with another round of endorsements expected. Marit Stiles is in London, Waterloo, Kitchener, and Scarborough, really barnstorming there. Bonnie Crombie was also in Scarborough today. And Mike Schreiner is in Huntsville campaigning in Parry Sound, Muskoka with his candidate there, Matt Richter, who came second back in 2022.
Let's follow up on a couple of these things here. Marit Stiles of the NDP, she has really had a punishing schedule over the last week or so. She has been to, and I made a list of it here, Beaches, East York, in hoping to take that one out of the Liberal column from the last House, but also Brampton, Hamilton, Kitchener, Brantford, Kingston, Ottawa, Peterborough, Bowmanville, Windsor, Sarnia, and London. She's been doing 3, 4, sometimes 5 events a day, far more than any of the other leaders. And interestingly, yes, most of those seats, most of those places that she went to were Tory-held ridings in the last House, but some of them are Liberal seats as well. Kingston, for example, was a Liberal-held seat. So I remember having her in here last week, and she was saying, we're going after the Conservatives. Well, not totally. She's actually going after the Liberals on some seats as well. Having said that, I note with interest Bonnie Crombie was here in our riding, Toronto St. Paul's, where this TV station is. She was just there the other day. The NDP won that seat the last 2 elections, both close races both times. So perhaps the Liberals are thinking that the leader's presence for a day in the riding might help tip it over to the Liberal side of things. She also, Crombie did, a stop in Mississauga, which I think could be interpreted one of 2 ways. Number 1, of course, she's from Mississauga, wants to get elected in Mississauga, so let's show the flag in Mississauga. Makes sense. On the other hand, if you're in the last week of a campaign and you really have to, as the expression goes, husband your time and resources well, why are you going to a place that you think you're a slam dunk to win? Maybe it suggests they don't think it's a slam dunk to win. Anyway, she's running in Mississauga, East Cooksville, and we'll know in a couple of days the results of all of that.
Right. We also mentioned Doug Ford being in Ottawa, and I just want to remind the audience that the national capital was really one of the few parts of this province where the PC party really struggled in the last few years. They lost 1 seat in the 2022 election with Jeremy Roberts losing to New Democrat Chandra Pasma in Ottawa, West Nepean. Then Marilee Fullerton resigned her seat unexpectedly in 2023. The eventual by-election in Canada Carleton was won by Karen McCrimmon, the Liberal. Mm-hmm. Those defeats, combined with the fact that the Premier didn't seem overly fond of his remaining Ottawa area MPPs, meant that there was this odd fact that the National Capital Region didn't really have any representation in Doug Ford's cabinet, and then he appointed a kind of Premier's advisor for the National Capital Region, and that became a whole issue. So one thing that Ford and the PC party will be trying to do in this election is just to build up their bench strength around Ottawa. And, they are probably not going to win in Ottawa Centre, for example, where we expect that to be a Liberal NDP race. But, seats around the Ottawa region that they can potentially, maybe not immediately, but potentially elevate somebody to cabinet, and that person would be Ottawa's voice in the government.
Because I just wrote a column about the race happening in Ottawa Centre, which I think will go up tomorrow, this is in my brain. Ottawa Centre, the current boundary ridings, so it's 25 years, right?
Something like
25 years since 1999, only ever been won by the Liberals and New Democrats, and it's almost even. It's one of them has won it for maybe 2 years more than the other. Right. The Conservatives have never won it.
Yeah.
So Catherine McKinney is running for the NDP in this one.
Yeah.
People will remember her. They ran for mayor, I guess, against Mark Sutcliffe and lost. Yep. Anyway, that column will be up in a couple of days. No, tomorrow. That column will be up tomorrow, and people can check that out.
That's the final of your columns,
yes,
looking
right.
at all of the star candidates.
From the 4 different major parties, that's right. Now, we do have an interesting question here from Matthew O'Meara, our producer, who wanted to ask, has there ever been a time where 2 party leaders have duked it out in the same single riding? Or would that be too big of a risk? And the answer is...
Is it yes?
Oh, absolutely, it's yes.
I was racking my brain when I saw this question in the script, and I genuinely.
Oh, you know what? That's a great question. Now, okay, the first thing that popped into my head was John Tory against Kathleen Wynne, but she wasn't the leader yet.
No, okay.
She wasn't the leader yet. He was the leader of the Ontario PC party, but she was not yet the leader of the provincial Liberals.
But an interesting race there, because part of what was going on in that contest was John Tory believing that it was really important that the PC party be competitive in Toronto again, which it had not been for multiple cycles at that point.
4 straight elections.
And would not again be competitive really until 2018. And needless to say, Kathleen Wynne won her seat in Don Valley West. John Tory did not win, and that posed problems for him later in his political career.
Well, I think you could say it contributed to the end of his political career provincially.
Yes.
But of course, opened a new door for him in radio and then municipally.
Yes, he would then go on to be mayor.
But have 2 party leaders ever gone against each other in the same riding? I can't think of a single example.
No, and I went through the admittedly, I'm not going to claim that this was extensive research, but I did try and go through the list of Liberal and PC leaders to see if any of them competed in the same riding at the same time. There might have been a smaller party that had a leader who competed against one of the larger ones. I wasn't able to find them. If somebody knows the answer to this, by all means, write in and tell us, because I would love to know.
As would I. And with that, off to issue 3. Last week was the 2025 Ontario election candidates debate on disability issues. Marjorie Knight, the NDP's candidate in Cambridge, Catherine McGarry, Liberal Party president, and Ignacio Mongrel for the Greens in University Rosedale. They were the 3 protagonists. The Progressive Conservatives. Now, who represented the Progressive Conservatives at this debate? No one.
An empty chair.
Because they never sent anybody. I shouldn't say never. Donna Skelly.
Right.
From Flamborough, Glanbrook, took part in a Cable 14 debate in Hamilton. She's the only PC party candidate I know of out of 124 in the whole province who has bothered to take part in a local all-candidates debate, either related to a riding or related to an issue. All the PC candidates dodged the debates. You could say that's shameful. I would never say such a thing. But you could say that's shameful. Anyways, okay, let's get into it. What came up in the disability issues?
Well,
today?
I want to say very briefly, I think that it's easy to assume that disability issues or accessibility issues broadly are a niche concern. And I will just say that I was really radicalized on accessibility issues when my child was born, and the first several winters pushing a stroller around the streets of Toronto in the winter, in much the same condition as they are right now as we record this podcast. just a total disaster, right? The sidewalks are never clear. You're pushing a heavy stroller and a kid through, impossible streets. And then even if you get indoors into various malls or public places, you suddenly become aware in a way that I certainly never was before, as I say, before having a kid, that like steps and stairs, and there are all sorts of obstacles to just moving freely around the city.
Let me put two wrinkles on this. Number one, or if you're a senior with a walker,
Yep.
same thing. And I learned about this very carefully 20 plus years ago. I had bad back problems. I needed a walker to get around. And I just found how absolutely non-navigable much of our capital city is for people with disabilities, because I was a person with a disability at that time. It was a nightmare trying to get around. Anyway, so that's why these issues are important.
Yes.
There's lots of people dealing with those kinds of issues. What do the parties have to say in this debate?
Right. So the opposition parties all are proposing to substantially increase ODSP payments, with the New Democrats, Liberals, and Greens all in their platform saying that they would double ODSP rates. This is the Ontario Disability Support Plan or Payment. Apologies, I always forget. But this is the primary form of social assistance we provide as a province to people with disabilities. Green leader Mike Schreiner has referred to the current rates as legislated poverty, because ODSP recipients get an income that is substantially lower than the poverty line, and then if they try to make any income on top of their ODSP payments, they face clawbacks for their benefits if they make more than $1,000 a month from other sources.
Sounds like that kind of defeats the point of the whole thing, but anyway.
Well, exactly, right? The way it's currently structured, a person on ODSP faces just really impossible choices.
So what do the parties have on offer in terms of either on top of increasing ODSP, beyond that?
Right. So the NDP have talked about providing rent supplements. They would also crack down on out-of-control rent increases. That's obviously an issue for lots of tenants, but if you are living with a disability and you have found a home that works for you, the prospect of losing that home when you have a set of supports built around that home, that can be very difficult, obviously. The Green Party has talked about streamlining application processes for supports. The Liberals are talking about increasing supports for supportive housing. I would say, broadly speaking, a lot of the opposition parties seem to all be singing out of the same hymn book, a lot of similar ideas.
No Tory representative at this debate, but what does that party have to say anyway?
Well, in the platform, they do talk about increasing ODSP with inflation, something that they have done in government, and increasing that exemption. It used to be, this was the income exemption for clawbacks used to be $200 a month. They did increase it to $1,000 a month. The party is still very focused on the idea of incentivizing work, and the Premier has talked about, if you're on ODSP but you are able to work, we want to encourage that kind of income. The whole idea of just clawing back that income in the first place is, of course, this idea of saving taxpayer money. But there's an interesting debate happening within the conservative space. There are conservatives out there who argue that these clawbacks basically function like a massive income tax and disincentivize people who would otherwise work from doing so. I have no idea how that debate is going to play out as we go forward in Ontario, but it's the kind of context I like to provide when I can.
Because these issues are very important, we had David Lepofsky on the agenda last night, so we should, I think we're going to have in the show notes a link to that interview with David Lepofsky, because frankly, we all need to know more about this. This was the year, right? 2025 was the year that Ontario was supposed to be barrier-free, as legislated.
I shouldn't laugh, but yeah.
Spoiler alert, we're not there yet.
Yeah.
So we had David on last night talking about the fact that when this law was passed by the Ontario legislature unanimously a quarter century ago, it looked quite hopeful and optimistic at the time. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of those hopes have been dashed by our lack of progress to date.
So much work left to do.
Indeed. Okay, on to the mailbag, JMM.
If you have a burning question or insightful comment, you can always send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. Here is a question from Mark Denny, who writes, "Hi, Steve and JMN. Love your podcast and show. Terrific insights and humor. I really appreciate it. I just have a quick question. If you voted early and the candidate you voted for gets removed by the party or they remove themselves, what happens to your vote? Is it still counted officially or is it deemed spoiled? I guess this raises the point of how much better a ranked ballot system of voting would be, especially if your candidate was removed from the ballot. Thoughts? Thanks Thanks so much, Mark Denny.
Mark, good one. Okay, our producer, Matthew O'Meara, reached out to Elections Ontario for this one, and they pointed him to the Elections Act, Section 30, subsection 2, subsection B, that states that any ballots cast for a withdrawn candidate are void
Yes.
and are considered rejected ballots.
Yeah.
So there we go. Now we know.
Yes, and Mark mentioned a ranked ballot system. That would depend very much on the rules that we put in place, but at least in theory, you could have a rule allowing any votes for a withdrawn candidate to then go to the next ranked choice that the voter had made. In the current system, of course, those votes are just lost. There is a deadline where candidates who leave before that deadline they can have their name not appear on the ballot, which is, of course, has come up in this election as a way to avoid vote splitting. That happened with the NDP candidate in Eglinton Lawrence, Natasha Doyle-Merrick. She dropped out before the deadline. So I believe she will not appear on the ballot. Do we have that right? Or
She will not appear on the ballot.
And so
That's right.
The intention of leaving when she did was specifically to keep her name and the New Democrat candidate off of the ballot and basically funnel all of the anti-Tory votes to the Liberal candidate.
I notice in 2 ridings, and I think this just happened either yesterday or today, in 2 ridings across the province, the Green candidate in each case recommended people in that riding not vote Green and vote actually for the New Democrat, whom they believed had a better chance to defeat the Conservative. Again, this is strategic voting.
Yes.
It gets complicated because if you're trying to find the best anti-Tory champion in each riding, it's going to be a different candidate depending on which riding you go to. In Parry Sound Muskoka, if you want to defeat the Tory, you probably do vote Green.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to Liberal or New Democrat. Anyway, it's complicated, but this is what you get with first past the post.
Yeah.
Now, we got one more. Here is one from Diane Roberts from Burlington. Why don't you take us through that?
Yeah, Diane writes, "Hello, Steve and JMM. I certainly appreciate the informative and insightful thoughts and comments that you provide each week. I do have a question that I'm sure you will be able to answer. Since the calling of the provincial election 16 months early, does that mean that the following election will also be called in 4 years' time, i.e. February 2029, or does it revert to a June date? And if it does revert back to that time frame, does it mean that the incoming government as of February 27th, 2025 will stay in power until June of 2029, meaning that they have an extra 16 months in power? Thanks for clarifying this for me. Diane Roberts, Burlington, Ontario." Diane, thank you so much for your question. Under the text of the Fixed Term Election Act, the next election would indeed be held on June 7th of 2029. The law states that an election should be held on the first Thursday of June, 4 years after the last general election. So June of 4 years plus 2025 gets you to 2029. In this very specific case, it would be June 7th of 2029. And because we love to spell out even more details than people ask for, the writs would be issued on May 9th of 2029 because that is also spelled out in the law. Now, the law could change. Right? The legislature has made this fixed term election law. They could change it. And of course, the law can also be ignored. This premier or, we don't know. Maybe Doug Ford does not stay for the full 4-year term. His successor could make a different choice about when to call an election. So the future is unwritten.
Well, that is true. And one other quick observation, because this is a February election, and if whoever wins sticks to the fixed election date and doesn't go until June of 2029, they actually don't get 4 years. They get 4 years and 4 months.
Yes.
So they get a little extra time. And that is all kosher, as they say. The Constitution of the country actually provides for 5-year terms, federally and provincially. So everything's still good there. We're within the 5 years. But it's funny. I remember when the McGuinty government passed the fixed election date law with a view towards making elections on a more even playing field, right? Take the power of capricious election calling away from the premier so that everybody starts at the same starting gate. Boy, that didn't last long, did it? Well, I mean, McGuinty followed his own law, but seems like advice now as opposed to the law.
Yes, yes. And I mean, it's perhaps not as bad as the case in Nova Scotia, where Tim Houston just introduced that province's fixed-term election law like 2 years ago and then called his own early election. If I can, very quickly, one other thing on election timing that I will just mention. Since 2014, we have had a pattern in this province of elections, both provincially and municipally, being held in the same year. One of the other effects of this early election is that it will break that pattern, that provincial elections and municipal elections will no longer be held on the same year, or at least in so long as this 4-year pattern continues.
Unless all the mayors of Toronto and other cities get together and decide they're going to have their own fixed election date law, which they will then violate and call elections whenever they want.
That I'm certain would end up in court.
Okay. That is the onpoli podcast for this February 25th, 2025, our last episode before the election. Remember, polls open at 9 a.m. and close at 9 p.m. on Thursday. That's Election Day. And the agenda will provide full coverage of Election Day starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and will stay on the air until after the last speech of the night is given. JMM and I will co-anchor the coverage, and we'll have lots of special guests join us throughout the night. And then join us again on Friday night for onpoli, where we will wrap it all up and put a bow on it.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew Amara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Want to thank the crew for making our video podcast happen, and let's do one special shout out today to somebody who is leaving us next week and who will no longer be with us, therefore, to take us into the future. But Sloan Westlake, we want to thank you for everything you've done for our program. We want to give the best to you, your family, and the East Lakes on the other side of the lake, if that makes any sense. Until next Friday, everybody, the day after Election Day, bye-bye.
Bye.